I'm joined now from Television Centre by our elections guru, Professor John Curtice, who's been crunching stats for almost 24 hours straight. Well, John, the SNP say they won because they've got the most councillors. Is that fair enough?
Well, it's not necessarily true that because they've got most councillors they won, at least if you define as one as being the party that got the largest share of the first preference vote. We need to bear in mind that the sizes of the wards in different councils in Scotland are not necessarily the same size, and in particular the wards in large urban authorities like Glasgow tend to be bigger than those in some of the more rural authorities, and given that Labour's vote is rather more urban than that of the SNP's, it may well be that actually the Labour Party ended up with more first preference votes while the SNP still had more seats. Certainly that's what happened in the 2007 local elections. I think the other piece I would simply add to this, and it's only a piece of the jigsaw, is that across the 6 councils where we collected the actual individual voting results, across all of those 6, actually the Labour's vote actually was up somewhat more than the SNP's, and given the 2007 baseline, we may discover, and I say it's only may, we may discover that when all the first preference votes have been added together, that perhaps the Labour Party had edged it. But in a sense, this is partly academic, because I would suggest the really striking thing is how different this result was this year from last year's result. What is perfectly clear is that whereas last year the SNP delivered a humiliating defeat on the Labour Party, this year we were back to something much closer to 2007, with the two parties being nip and tuck. And to that extent, at least, I suspect, at least in terms of moral victories, in terms of who at least looks to be in a stronger position now than they did 48 hours ago, I suspect Labour will claim that victory, and certainly the SNP have not been able to replicate that stupendous performance they achieved 12 months ago. This, by the standards of what we might expect a decade ago, yes, a very good performance, but by more recent standards, i.e. the very high standard of year, it wasn't particularly exceptional at all.
OK, now, as you've alluded to, the obvious way of making a judgment in all this would be to look at who won the most first preference votes. But unlike the elections in England, where it's pretty simple to say who won as a share of the vote, we can't do that, can we?
Well, to be in fairness, nobody's collected all the results in England. What we've done in England is again to collect a sample of the results and to use that to estimate something which doesn't actually exist, which is what would have happened across Great Britain as a whole if the voters had voted in the way it happened in local elections. But from that, certainly it's perfectly clear that in the English local elections, the Labour Party was ahead of the Conservatives, and there is no doubt about the winner. In Scotland, we don't have the same experience of doing that, and in truth, it's a much more difficult exercise to do north of the border. So in the end, people will collect all the votes, and we will eventually find out who had more first preferences. But as I said, it's not whoever is first, they're not going to be very far ahead, and it's the fact that it's very close as compared with a big win last year that I would suggest is the big contrast and the big message to take away.
Look, I'm interested in who you think people, or what you think people are comparing things with when they vote in local elections now in Scotland. I mean, for example, the SNP are saying, look, we've been in power for 5 years. Look what's happened to the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats in government in Westminster. They're getting hammered. We've been in power for 5 years. We're still gaining councillors. So in that sense, they're saying, well, because we've been in power in Holyrood. On the other hand, I don't think anybody would say that the collapse in the Liberal Democrat vote is because of anything very much that Willie Reddy has been doing. It's because of the coalition government. So are people thinking of Holyrood or thinking of Westminster?
Well, the answer is probably a mixture of both. The truth is that certainly as far as the Democrats are concerned, us last year, they are suffering because of voters' dissatisfaction with their role in the UK coalition. I think certainly given the discrepancy between these local elections and indeed any of the Holyrood voting intention polls, though of course we've not had it for quite a while, it certainly suggests that people weren't simply voting on the basis of what they thought of Holyrood. Maybe some of them were voting on local issues, and maybe some of them were voting on Westminster, and that's one of the reasons why Labour did better than we expected, because after all, Labour in the Westminster opinion polls is doing relatively well now. One other point to make, by the way, the SNP were not alone across the UK in improving on their position in the previous local elections. The Labour Party in Wales are, of course, in power in the devolved administration in Wales. They've been in office indeed all the way through since 1999, and they made very spectacular gains indeed. Indeed, there is no dispute in Wales about who won the election. So in truth, yes, Mr Sammy might want to compare himself favourably with David Cameron and Nick Clegg, but actually Carwyn James, in terms of those who are in government, probably gets the prize for who in office did best.
All right, John. Luke, thanks very much for that. Get some sleep.
I will do.